I'm Chris Carter of the Locked On Steelers podcast. Today, we're going to talk about why character in the players the Steelers are drafting is just as important in the talent that they're drafting this year, especially when it comes to offense, and I'll explain why that's such the case. That and several other things, including Mock Draft Monday here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things in the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making us your first listen every day because we're your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can get $200 back in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet or more. That's right, $200 if your bet hits. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. All right, y'all. Hope you have a great weekend, a great Easter Sunday. It's draft month. The draft happens the end of this month. I believe April 25th is the first day, but it's April 1st. So we're going to focus a lot more on the draft coming up. I'm going to start doing my positional rankings, and we'll eventually get to my top 100 list, which you will be able to have on with you for the draft and stuff. And as we keep track of all those expectations there. So let's talk about a few aspects here when it comes to the draft plans that the Steelers have. Now, we have gone over a lot about talent and a lot about how guys, which position's more important, and we'll get to more of the positional things in the next segment. But I want to talk about why the character and the leadership part of, and the potential for leadership part of the draft plans is just as important this year, especially when it comes to the offensive players the Steelers want to get. The Steelers defense has always had the leadership. That has always been a torch that was passed down. The succession between the Troy Polamalu, James Ferrier, James Harrison, Casey Hampton, like that crew, they passed it down to Cam Hayward, who kept the torch alive, and TJ Watt has now inherited it with Minkah Fitzpatrick. And you've seen the succession of leadership and of guys who are like the buck stops with me on defense carry over, and it's mattered. You go back and you look back over the years for the Steelers, the defense has been able to retain its ability to keep points off the board. They just ranked 6th this past year, 10th the year before that. And then, in 2020 and 2019, they ranked in the top 5. So it's a tradition that they've still been able to maintain even through the changes there. But the offense, less so since since Ben Roethlisberger suffered his injury. He had to have the 1 year in 2020, but you haven't seen that carry over on offense. And that's really important. And I think undervalued even in what the Steelers are trying to do as far as get something reestablished for the offense. And I think it's a big reason why, it was such a disappointment that Kenny Pickett wasn't a guy who could help with that, because that was who he was at Pitt. He helped reestablish culture, and he helped push that team to their first ever ACC championship. That's why I think they're getting Russell Wilson, so that he can be a guy that can be part of doing that on offense. That's why they drafted Najee Harris, because he was part of that, part of the good things that were going on at Alabama at the time. And you can't always get leaders. Like George Pickens isn't a leader. He's not a guy that everyone's going to galvanize around. He's just a really talented dude who, if he can follow the right guys, he'll be a heck of an asset. But you need guys who can put those guys in check, so those guys can look up to and follow into battle for you when you're talking about the Steelers and what they need. And to give an example of this, I want to point to we've seen however many bad games stack upon themselves for the offense. It was like the longest streak in NFL history of games without 400 yards of total offense or whatever, and things like that. It's not no secret. The Steelers offense had been bad for a stretch, and no one was fixing it anytime soon during that stretch. The Steelers defense never had stretches like that. Like when you look at their even some of their roughest years, they did not have like back-to-back games where they give up over 30 points many times. And in fact, I went back and looked it up since Mike Tomlin took over. There have only been 3 instances since 2007 that the Steelers have had at least back-to-back games with allowing 30 points each in both contests. It happened in 2021, it happened in 2013, and it happened in 2011. And each of those times it only lasted 2 games. Now you're probably thinking like, well, Chris, what does that matter? I'm sure like that's the same thing for every other team. Not so much. When I looked at around the NFL, in the last 3 years alone, 30 of the 32 teams have allowed that streak to happen. And the Steelers are one of those teams. But out of those teams, 24 of them are allowed to happen multiple times. And again, in just the last 3 years. So there's the majority of the NFL that has allowed multiple games of over 30 points scored by their opponent against them in longer stretches than 2 games, more times than the Steelers have allowed it in Mike Tomlin's entire tenure. And I say all that to say, the reason that happens, for the most part, the Steelers have had talent on defense, but even when their talent wasn't top tier, I mean, even when they had kind of like, just so guys, like if you remember, like in 2015, when the Steelers, their defense, they were having a young Ryan Shazier, Cam Hayward was coming into age, Stephon Tuitt was very young. Their secondary was not great at the time, but they found ways to make sure that their defense came to play, and at least they came correct, because I like, guys like Cam Hayward, guys like TJ Watt, they would say, hey, like, not today, not on my watch. And if it happened the last game, it ain't happening the next game. And time again, the defense would do that. And that's because they've been able to get leaders, locker room guys that set the tone that other people get behind and say, hey, that's my guy, I'm going to follow. And you look around the Steelers offense, there's not any guys like that. There's guys who could become that. Isaac Seumalo could be that, but he's a quiet leader. We've just seen it. He's just not the vocal guy. I think Najee Harris can be that at times, but I think that Pat Freiermuth, he has the potential to be that at times, but there's no bona fide like guy, like when Franco Harris passed away, and that was such a sad day, and they were going to honor him for that game. Who came out the tunnel with the flag with Franco Harris, and everyone got behind him, but Cam Hayward. That everyone gets behind Cam Hayward when it's time to go to work, and I think that's what this offense needs, are guys like Cam Hayward's, and again, not just all pro guys that are talents, but guys who can be really good, but also be good character guys and good leaders guys and guys that come from good programs. I think that's a big reason why the Steelers do also look at the bigger schools, the more successful schools that often produce the guys that are coming from winning cultures, because they want winning culture as part of their team. I think that's what they're hoping to get with a Broderick Jones as he develops with the Steelers offensive line, and the mindset that he's going to help establish there as far as what's supposed to be the expectations there. That's why I think that they're going to be looking at guys like J.C. Latham, like Amarius Mims, and seeing which guys can they bring in who will, while they're young, learn from the leaders that they're assembling. Because I think, like, again, a Russell Wilson, paired with Najee Harris and Pat Freiermuth, who have been on the team, I think they're probably the more recognizable, quote unquote, leaders of the offense right now. I think that can help reset a culture problem that the Steelers have had on offense. And again, not a culture problem in the sense that nobody cared, but it was just like hey, like when Ben Roethlisberger retired, there was no passing of the torch. Kenny Pickett couldn't be there for that. Ben Roethlisberger didn't get along with Mason Rudolph. There was nobody to say, hey, like, this is what it's like to lead. This is what it's like to make sure, like, hey, we just had a bad game last week. I'm going to make sure my guys don't have the same bad game this week. And I think that's part of what the Steelers are going to be looking for in this draft class. I think that's what they've been looking for in free agency. I think that's why they were so happy to sign Patrick Queen, not just because of his talent, but because he can be one of those other leadership guys on defense. But they need those guys on offense, and that's going to be something that I think also plays a big part in what the Steelers are trying to do. I think that's a big part of what Andy Weidl's researching and why Mike Tomlin meets with guys that he wants to get. It's not just trying to see them up close and see if they see their muscles or see how fast they run. It's seeing how these guys respond to certain things and testing, like, hey, can we get a guy who, when the chips are down, they're our leader, and everyone's like, I'm behind that man. I'll follow that man into battle. That's what the Steelers, I think, are for sure looking for as part of their draft concerns. But I know there's a lot of people out there that want the Steelers to just draft Jackson Powers Johnson and get the center no matter what in the first round. I want to go over scenarios where that might happen if you look at this, at how things could play out in the NFL draft. We'll do that here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We'll be right back. But first, I want to remind you this show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in America. The sports calendar is loaded right now, and FanDuel's making it even more exciting to get in on all the action. And right now, new customers can get $200 back in bonus bets with your first $5 bet winning, or $5 or more bet winning when you sign up on FanDuel. And FanDuel's an app you can download right to your phone. You can go to their website, FanDuel.com/lockedon, and you can take advantage of that deal. But that's really $200 that you can use on your own bonus bets, like point spreads, money lines, player props, and so much more. Don't forget, FanDuel gives you action on both the tournaments, men and women's, that are going on right now, headed to the Elite Eight and the Final Four, but also Major League Baseball, because baseball's back, baby. NBA as they get ramped up for the playoffs, NHL as they get ramped for the playoffs, and so much more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to make your first bet a big win. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon for new customers to get $200 back in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more win. And that is on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue with this show, and I wanted to go over scenarios because I was thinking through different things. We'll get to mock draft Monday in a bit, and I'll tell you, I had a little experiment that I didn't tell you guys about when I put out the requirements for this one, but we'll get to that in a minute. But I know that there's a lot of people that just think, hey, just at all costs, get the center. Don't play around with it. Just go get them. And I can tell you just from personal knowledge and just how I see things with the Steelers and what I understand, tackle and corner are going to be higher priorities than center just because of the positional value. And we've talked about Alan Saunders on this show. Omar Khan, I think, believes in the positional value thing, and I think that's something that he's looking at very seriously. So if you're looking at those two positions, which of the players have to be gone for the Steelers to pass up on a tackle or a corner and get center? Because like there's a long list of both positions, tackle and corner, but there's not a long list of guys who are first round grades. Now there's a longer list than several other positions because corner and tackle are very deep this year. But I think part of it is how many of those guys just simply rank over the top center on your board, and that's where things can get really interesting. Come draft day. Now, let's go over scenarios here where we look at all the different picks and who's going where, and the different positions and how they have to fall. So let's say, like, if I'm the Steelers and I'm looking at a Jackson Powers Johnson as your top center. If you think Graham Barton is, because he could flex there, maybe. But for the sake of this experiment, we're talking about Jackson Powers Johnson for some of the people who want to see that. There are, in my opinion, about 6 tackles who I would rank over him. So you would need, in my opinion, 6 tackles to come off the board before that can happen. But also on top of the tackles, I think there's really like 4 corners that also I think would fall into that. So if we look at just those 2 positions, that's 10 players that I think would need to come off the board for the Steelers to be like, okay, maybe we just do go with that. And those 10 players would also have to be amongst what we expect at least 3 wide receivers to be drafted, maybe 4 quarterbacks to be drafted. That's 17 players right there alone. That doesn't include, if someone goes after Brock Bowers at tight end. That doesn't include if, someone takes a stab at Jerzon Newton of Illinois, or Byron Murphy at Texas, or Dallas Turner and Laiatu Latu, guys at all these other positions. I look at this and I think, man, I think it's really stacked against the Steelers to go, if you're going to pick based on value, if you're going to pick based on best player available. I just have a hard time thinking that Jackson Powers Johnson is just going to be that at the right time in the draft this year. Now, there are some who are starting to speculate that maybe Jackson Powers Johnson falls to the second round. And if that happens, I think that's a golden situation for the Steelers, because then they can go and get one of these centers in the second round. Because if Jackson Powers Johnson's available in the second, maybe Zach Frazier is too. And I think either one of those guys or Cedric Van Pran would all be good, solid additions, the guys that could take over the reins at center. But that's the thing, though, is that we're talking about if you want to secure that center in the first round, I think it's a lot harder this year because, again, going over, you're probably going to wonder, well, Chris, you said numbers. You said how many tackles you would take over Jackson Powers Johnson. I think there's, again, at least 6, maybe, no, I think 6 is the comfortable number. There's Joe Alden of Notre Dame. He's going top 10. You don't have to worry about him. There's Olu Fashanu out of Penn State, who I think was looking at maybe going top 10 early, but I think that there's been some pullback on his value. But the guy that I think that really starts where the Steelers can potentially draft this guy is Talisa Fuaga out of Oregon State, just because I think that's an interesting fit for him because he's a mauler, he's a run blocker, he destroys defensive lines. I think that's something the Steelers absolutely want in their bag, just like J.C. Latham destroys defensive lines. I think that's where these are two guys who, if they're on the board, the Steelers are sprinting to the podium because they're going to be so ecstatic about that. I think Amarius Mims is another guy who could definitely be that guy, but he has the less experience. So with his injuries and such. So I think with Amarius Mims, I still think that his ceiling is way too high to pass up with his length. The one tackle that's on the board here that I kind of look at kind of funny is Troy Fautanu, because some people project that he might need to be a guard or a center because he's 6'4" and he doesn't have, the best frame to be the big bullying offensive tackle. But I do look at those and I say, like, man, if you could get one of those monsters, one of those big guys that take on blocks, that change the line of scrimmage, I think that's more valuable than what Jackson Powers Johnson brings to the table. And simply because I don't think Jackson Powers Johnson is like a future multi-time all-pro type of center. I think he can be a really good center. But, like, Maurkice Pouncey don't just grow on trees. They take time to get, it takes time and investment. And I think that's where the Steelers are hoping that this year they'll be able to bear some fruit from searching for the right center there. But that's where I think it has to come down to if the Steelers are going to get there. And again, we're also talking about probably, receivers wise, Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, Roma Dunza, Brian Thomas, Adonai Mitchell. Like there's still some guys that I'm just like, man, like there's some really interesting talents in these groups here that I think make a lot of sense for what the Steelers want to do in the early rounds. But again, I think that offensive tackle just takes the cake because there's just so many options this year that would be legit first round options, and they're great fits for what the Steelers want to do, and they just bring better value than what Jackson Powers Johnson, I think, has been able to show on tape / with his resume. And that's not to say he's not good. It's just that I think that there's other guys that are ready to, see what's just show what they've got. I think that there's other guys I think that could be rising above him in the draft boards there. So if you're wondering what it's going to take to draft a center in the first round, I think that's it. You're going to need a serious run at all these other positions, and that's just it. I think it's very unlikely that it happens that way. That's why I keep looking at the prospect of drafting a center in the second round, because that makes sense to me. I think you could find a way to do that. You could trade up, but I think right now, bottom line is the Steelers, they need both of these positions, but tackle and corner, so I guess it's 3 positions. Tackle and corner, to me, I think corner a little bit less, but tackle especially, that's going to take the precedent in today's NFL in this situation. When we come back, it's Mock Draft Monday. I'll go over the picks of the winner and explain their picks and why I picked them, and what all played into an experiment that I had when I put out the call for Mock Draft Mondays. I'm Chris Carter, the Locked On Steelers podcast. Stick with us. We'll be right back. But first, I want to remind you this show is brought to you by BetterHelp Therapy Online. What's the first thing that you would do if you had an extra hour in your day? Maybe go for a run, read a book, or be there for a friend. But what about being there for yourself? That's where therapy can help you find what matters the most to you so that you can do more of it. I've benefited from the help of good therapists in my life who've helped me sort through the most important things that I try to balance every single day. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp knows life can be busy and stressful, so it's designed to be suitable for your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional cost or no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue our show here as we dip into Mock Draft Monday. There's only a few more of these left. I think we got, 3 more Mock Draft Mondays coming now before the draft. Time flies, don't it? But let's get to this week's winner, and I'll explain some picks there, but I'll also get into why I put the rules that I put this time around, because I wanted to see something, and you all did not disappoint with how you guys played into it. But this week's winner is Luke Sains, who had a very good smattering of players here. Now, this week's rule was you were not allowed to draft a wide receiver until at the earliest 3rd round. It didn't mean you couldn't draft a wide receiver. It doesn't mean you had to draft a wide receiver. You wanted to draft a receiver, you couldn't draft them in 1 or 2. You had to get them in the 3rd round. And let's look at what Luke did here. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see his picks, but I'll explain the picks out here for the audio audience. With the 20th overall pick, Luke took Talisa Fuaga. To me, that's the 3rd best tackle on the board. That is a home run of a pick. You take that, you go home, you're happy. He's a right tackle, Broderick's a left tackle, and let the mauling begin. But after that, I thought was really interesting. And this is why I picked it, was because he hit on a lot of other needs too. He got Ruko Rororo, the defensive tackle out of Clemson. I think that'll be a good fit for what the Steelers are trying to do on the inside. Then with that first third round pick, he got Roman Wilson. And I thought that was a very good move, because Roman Wilson, I think, is a good fit as a number 2 option right now behind George Pickens and working with the other guys that they have. Then he made some sort of trade, and Luke got Cedric Van Pran with the 85th overall pick. So that was impressive. So I guess he just traded up in the 3rd to get another thing there. So there you have it through 3 rounds. You've got Fuaga, Orororo, Wilson, and Van Pran. You've got center, tackle, D-line, and receiver. 4 of the bigger needs hit right away. And then I loved how Luke kind of took the shots down the line here. Cam Hart, a longer-armed, longer-bodied corner out of Notre Dame. Jarvis Brownlee, cornerback out of Louisville. Maris Lefuau. All those guys that came in the later rounds here. I think the interesting thing is the corners who could be, who could be, fighting for their jobs, and trying to prove it amongst the sea of other guys trying to prove at corner this year, because this year's guys should be returning. Corey Trice should be back from injury. So that's that. But let's go back to the early picks here. Again, Fuaga, complete mauler, destroyer of defensive lines. Makes a lot of sense. Ruko Rororo, I think, is going to be a good fit. Cedric Van Pran, there was at one point where he was the top-rated center in this draft class. That fell off by a good bit, but I think Cedric Van Pran is still a guy who can get the job done at center as a starter and kind of keep things rolling. But all that to be said, let's look at what I was talking about here, because when I put out this call for mock drafts, and I did it on Sunday, I waited a little bit. I apologize if you missed it because it wasn't on like Friday night, but I wanted to see if Steelers fans could not take a wide receiver in the first 2 rounds of the draft, who would they take? What would they, what positions would they value? And overwhelmingly, it was offensive line, and especially offensive tackle. And there were some smatterings of center as well in there. But when I posted this on both the Locked On Steelers Facebook group, which you can join at any time, we're looking to builds with some new moderators that'll help us in the long run. Or you posted it on Twitter, and you were looking at our mock drafts there. But when I was looking at either of those options, I saw by the majority, most of you all were picking offensive tackle or center or both before wide receiver. So I was interested to see, would some people go corner? Would more people go, would some people want that defensive lineman early on? And even here, Luke got a defensive lineman. But the overwhelming concern are the trenches. And I think that shows that you guys are, wait for it, got to take down this, you guys are locked on, because I think you guys are paying attention to what the Steelers' needs are. Again, the Steelers, Mike Tomlin came out and said, our offense is going to go through our bigs. And guess what's the one major group they haven't invested in yet in this offseason? And it's the bigs. So if Mike Tomlin's going to get more out of the bigs, he needs to invest more in the bigs. And that's where I think the Steelers are right now. And so I think you all are paying attention. And if they come out with a draft like this from that Luke brought here for us, Fuaga, I don't think Fuaga's falling to 20, but I've seen him fall to 20 in certain mocks, and that's very intriguing. I think if that happens, just roll out the red carpet because they're going to get that guy. But you get him and then Cedric Van Pranger in the third round. I really think that there's I think there's a lot of good things that happen here in this mock draft. And if they happen for the Steelers, watch out. I think this could be a special draft class. And again, it doesn't have to just be this class. It could be several other things. But my point here is the Steelers are going to probably get an offensive lineman with the first 2 picks, maybe both with the first 2 picks. And that could be very interesting to see with all the other needs that they have. And again, that they haven't addressed, losing Deontay Johnson yet with any big move there. Lots of things to be concerned about. But again, a good mock draft here from Luke to add on several of the big things that the Steelers need. I'm your host, Chris Carter, for the Locked On Steelers podcast. This was your Mock Draft Monday episode. We're back tomorrow with more in your Pittsburgh Steelers. But always remember, if you're enjoying this show, find us on Apple Podcasts or anywhere podcasts are hosted. Rate us 5 stars, leave us a positive comment. You do both at the same time. You get a shout out at the end of the show. Thanks to everyone for tuning in on your favorite podcasting apps or on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of your daily Monday to Friday episodes on your Pittsburgh Steelers right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.